Good afternoon, and thank you for joining another edition of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce's Thought Leadership Series. Today, we'll be discussing security in the cannabis industry with Chris Eggers, CEO of CC Security Solutions based out of San Francisco, California. Chris, if you're not familiar, he's unique in the sense, I think, that he brings real world, police knowledge and law enforcement background into the cannabis security space. So I think he speaks with a lot of credibility on what works, what doesn't, and has been a real force in the industry here in California recently as well. And so, Chris, there you are. Glad to have you with us. Thanks for joining.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. I'll let you kind of take over and kind of give a little bit of an intro into things, and then we'll circle back and maybe have some questions and things at the end for everybody.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So, cannabis security, that's means so many different things to so many different people. And we're going to get into that a little bit. Obviously, so many different topics we can talk about as well. And so today, wanted to focus on surviving a security incident. Obviously, since during and post-COVID, or if we can call it post-COVID, we've seen an increased number of attacks against cannabis businesses of all license types. Retail seems to be sort of highlighted most, but it is not just retail. It is all license types that are being affected by the increasingly violent burglaries and robberies that are occurring, not just in California. Seattle is a good example, but really it's an industry-wide issue. And then, there's a lot of different pieces that come off of that we're helping folks navigate and work through, namely insurance, which we're going to talk about in some detail. So Matthew, you had great intro. Thank you very much. I am the founder of CC Security Solutions. I served as a police officer for a little over 12 years, started with Oakland. In Oakland, I worked about half of my time there, undercover, infiltrating burglary and robbery organizations in part. And then I transferred to San Francisco. I served there for another 6 years or so before I quit to start CC Security Solutions. And it's been a great ride so far. Really loving it. One of our most interesting sort of objectives so far has been working with the City of Los Angeles and the Department of Cannabis Regulation, developing educational content for social equity applicants. And through that sort of, we start to peel back some of the onion layers about cannabis security and what is it, and how do we navigate it? And as we know, it's a moving target. And security incidences are, again, like we said, increasing in nature and becoming more violent. And so on this webinar, we're going to focus on surviving an incident, and how meeting the regulatory minimum requirements does not limit your incident profile risk. There are, as we all know, very strict regulations around security within cannabis. And some people view that as just a hurdle to get over, a box to check, and then moving on. But, your security plan is a living, breathing document. It needs to evolve with your business. And it's because, burglaries and robberies are commonplace, increasing in nature and becoming more violent. And we need to protect our people first and foremost, and then our business and our assets. So here's a couple headlines recently from all over California with respect to some of the violence that takes place. These headlines specifically talk about dispensaries, but again, this is license types of all kinds. A lot of indoor cultivation is being targeted, distribution as well. I know obviously there's a lot of conversations around safe banking and cash handling, but it is our experience that it is not just the cash that folks are after, that offenders are after. It is the product that they're after. And so, again, it just speaks to that this issue is not just related to retail. So some of the business risks of a security incident, obviously loss of cash and product, as we discussed, injury or even death. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. License violations, denied insurance claims. We are definitely going to touch on that. A lot of people are learning the hard way, and we're trying to speak as much as we can about this issue, so folks are in a good spot. We don't want to see anybody step in landmines. But denied insurance claims is rampant. And we're going to talk about how to alleviate that in part. And then civil litigation, premise liability and negligent security specifically are increasing lawsuits that we're seeing in the cannabis industry. So let's talk about civil liability first. Premise liability is when somebody gets hurt at your business site because you failed to maintain safe conditions. Negligent security, this is more toward like security guards, when somebody gets hurt at your business due to a criminal act or activity that you failed to adequately protect against. And an example of that generically would be if a guard acts a certain way or hurt somebody and is, outside of their scope, outside of their bounds of what they're allowed to do. If it was even illegal contact or detention, negligent security claims are increasing in the cannabis space, and they're after the deepest pockets. A couple common security myths is that cops will come to defend your legal business. I can speak to this, very intimately as a former police officer. I would say that, and maybe law enforcement would like to argue this, but don't really see how. The culture within law enforcement is still, and this is what they're teaching, is that cannabis is such a bad drug that's leading to the opioid crisis, specifically in San Francisco, and that's in my experience couldn't be farther from the truth. I've spoken to, I'd say conservatively, 100 people in my law enforcement career, whether it be in uniform or undercover, who actively had a needle in their arm, and whether it was a conversation undercover, or if it was in uniform providing resources or calling for medical attention in San Francisco, we would speak and talk to folks. And I would find that a lot of folks want to tell their story about how they, started using drugs, and it was pills. It was not cannabis that was leading to the heavy opioid use. But law enforcement, as recent as, right before I left the department, I took a class about cannabis just to see what they were teaching. And it was, reefer madness and the devil's lettuce and, the like. So cops are stretched thin these days. That is true in some municipalities. And that's when offenders are targeting these businesses. But they're also giving really poor advice. Cops are saying to folks, you should get an AK-47 and stand on your roof. And the cannabis industry, as we all know, is now legal, and they wouldn't tell that to Nordstrom or Bloomingdale's or something like that. So, there is a bit of a disconnect there, to say the least. Another common myth was that guards offer better protection. Again, we talked a little bit about the civil liability regarding guards and some of the issues that come with that. It's really important with guards to understand and have a hand in the standard operating procedure development, so that you as the business owner knows exactly how they're to act and what they will do in a certain situation, or at least what the game plan would be. Another myth is that insurance will always cover your losses. We're going to talk about this a little bit more detail, but it's just important to note that insurance policies have very specific exclusions and requirements around security. And so if you're not compliant with your own policy, even though you are compliant with local or state rules or regulations, you could see minimal or even pennies on the dollar insurance claims after an incident. And then I'd say the biggest one is that if you do everything right, that you won't be hit, you won't be a target, and absolutely a myth. I mean, doing things correctly is obviously extremely important for regulatory reasons as well as operational reasons, but being that folks look at some offenders look at the cannabis industry and these businesses as having, a lot of assets, whether it be cash or product, will always be a target. So preparation for an incident is always best. Again, planning, SOPs, SOP development, conversations with your staff, and then taking it to the next level and having, actual specific staff training is one of the best ways to prepare. Understand that human safety is paramount above everything else. And there are certain steps to take after an incident for a business owner. Obviously, again, we care about our people first and foremost, but then at some point, the business owner needs to put, their different hat on and look at their products and their assets and see what went out the door and what are the next steps to get back up operational as fast as possible and compliantly. And so establishing SOPs for open and closing and security, for example, is really important. Just contemplating the things that can happen and when they can happen, things as simple as open and closing procedures. So if you're not the person doing it, that function's being delegated and executed exactly how you want it to. Maintenance of equipment, security system equipment is functioning properly is, believe it or not, something that we see go by the wayside all the time. These systems are very expensive. Labor has skyrocketed. Equipment prices are up. And, it's really important that after you spend this, expensive line item in your security system, getting it up and running, that you do proper maintenance on your equipment, because a lot of the stuff is covered for 1, 3, or 5 years. And so if you properly maintain your equipment, obviously you're in compliance, but you get more life out of it. And like I said, it's expensive. And then create an emergency plan and practice it. Again, even as simply as just having conversations, we find that, folks are a little bit more in tune once these conversations start happening. Now, this slide is very necessary, but easier said than done, right? Stay calm and remember that human safety is paramount. The goal here during, whether it be an active robbery or, a burglary at your business, but specifically, let's say a robbery, it's important to make sure that we don't do anything to prolong this incident, that it ends as quickly as possible and ideally as peacefully as possible. And if the security systems and procedures are designed not only in compliance with rules and regulations, but specifically your insurance policy, then you can have a better chance of being made whole. And, when that claim check comes, it's very helpful on the business side of things. But in order to get there, we got to survive the incident. We want to stay calm. Remember that human safety is paramount. When possible, cooperate, try not to fight or bargain. Again, every situation is different. So it's very easy to sit on one side of a computer screen and say these things, but, robberies specifically are extremely stressful for those involved. Things can change very quickly, but the goal is to have the situation end as soon as possible. And then when possible, and if it's safe to do so, notify other staff, and then of course, law enforcement. It's important to remember as many details as you can for the investigation afterwards. But there's also other things that you want to do is once you contact law enforcement, you want to assess the damage, preserve evidence when you can. This one right here is sometimes gives me a chuckle because TV and movies have really sort of killed it when it comes to that specific item, because people sometimes think that, there's just DNA and fingerprints on everything. And you might be disappointed if your particular agency responds and doesn't dust for fingerprints. But as an example, in Oakland, they just don't dust for fingerprints. It's not something that they do. But every agency is different. You want to preserve evidence when possible. And that could be as simply as making copies of the video that's installed in your business as well. You will have to contact your insurance company. You do have to report to regulators, and there could be some support necessary for law enforcement investigations. I always say this: maintain records and documents of everything. And when I was a police officer, we would sometimes ask, I would never demand it because it was, in my opinion, it was outside the scope. But let's say there was an incident on the same block as a dispensary, and we know that you have the best camera system on the block because, unlike any other business, you're regulated and they're not. You have requirements and they don't. So there's times where we've asked businesses for video that was totally unrelated to that business. And I would always tell the operator, I'm like, hey, take my business card, take my name. Here's the report number. Keep a file of this, because it's increasing that law enforcement is aware and becomes aware that these businesses are the most dialed in, I would argue, on the block. And so there's an opportunity though, where law enforcement may ask for video totally unrelated to your business. But it's important to maintain a record of that and document everything. So that could be helpful potentially at community meetings or, neighborhood meetings, should that be the case for you. But law enforcement won't go out of their way to, applaud you. So it's on you to make sure that you maintain a record and document how helpful that has been, if you do come across that. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about guards. They can be extremely valuable, but they have their limitations, and it's important to understand, especially since COVID, what that has done to the guard industry. COVID has had a huge negative effect on the guard industry. Really difficult to find qualified personnel and then retain that personnel. So a lot of guard companies are sort of fighting for the same pool of folks, but it has definitely had a negative effect because of COVID. Not all guards are trained or have the same experience. We found that there's issues managing multiple tasks, but then it's really important to set realistic expectations. of what your guard is capable of doing or not capable of doing. What is it within their scope and what is not within their scope? There are some facilities that in clients that we work with where the guards are more like reception. And then there's some that, they are actually, meant to be security guards and have a totally different function. But it's really important to set that expectation first and foremost right out the gate. So hiring more guards is often a gut reaction after an incident, and certainly the status quo supports that. But in doing so, it's just not the most cost-effective approach. It does not address the root cause of an incident typically. We'll see in another slide coming up shortly, if not the next one, that guards may not actually be a deterrent and may open you up for unnecessary liability. So here's a couple headlines, recent headlines around guards within the cannabis industry, specifically this one out of San Francisco where a guard's gun was taken. So the argument that, an armed guard is a deterrent is, I don't believe, to be a valid argument anymore. We have enough documentation to show that armed guards do not deter crime, and in fact could potentially, lose their firearms. We've seen guards be kidnapped. We've seen a lot of bad stuff happen. And so in an ideal world, a guard would deter crime. But I always ask folks, well, what if, right? What if it does not? So now we're looking at, potential shootout on our facility or within our facility or on our property, which obviously is a big deal in and of itself. But if you drill it down just to the business, that absolutely affects business operations as well. And so there maybe time for another webinar, but there are other technologies and processes that can be used to help in part limit guard hours that still do provide the level of, I'd say, surveillance, not security, that people are after. But you are not required to have armed guards. That decision is totally up to you. Again, you're going to hear me say this multiple times, but check with your insurance policy. Really look at what the exclusions are, because some policies exclude firearms on the premise. And so it's important to make sure that in general, when designing your security system or in your security solution, and guards are a piece of that, but not the entire pie of it, that those decisions get made with the insurance policy in mind, so that it's not an if, it's a when that bad thing happens. That you're in compliance with your insurance policy and have the best chance of getting an insurance claim to the amount that you expect. And so the right answer is up to each and every specific business. But in part, you could own your guard's liability. We talked about civil lawsuits. So it's important to vet your guard vendors, verify credentials of every single individual guard. They are required to have guard cards, and that information can be found, at least for California, can be found in the Bureau of Security Investigative Services website, the BSIS. That is the governing body for guards. There are very specific training that they need to obtain. There's ongoing education, and then specifically there's insurance requirements as well. Insurance won't pay out if you haven't met your policy requirements. One horror story for you. There was a facility that got broken into. They had $200,000 in loss. The very next day, they became our client. And one of the first things we did was an insurance policy review. And unfortunately had to be the bearer of bad news, because this specific policy required that facility to have a very specific multi-point locking door. And whoever designed the facility didn't contemplate that. And so they didn't have the right door. And the claim was for $200,000, and their check ultimately came back and it was right around 11,000, a little bit less. So right around almost like 10 grand. And it's in part because they didn't meet the requirements of their insurance policy. But they were compliant with local rules and regulations, state rules and regulations. But everyone is looking in part, through different scope. Insurance is only looking at what their exclusions are. So it's really important to have a clear understanding of what those are. And then when dealing with various vendors, having well-defined contracts, holding vendors accountable, meeting their insurance requirements as well, extremely important. I cannot stress that enough, how insurance affects specifically security. So different types of insurance cover different types of losses. Obviously, consult with an insurance expert for your specific needs, but you aren't automatically covered just because you have insurance. And I speak to, a lot of folks, obviously lean on their attorneys for their contracts and everything, but I speak to a lot of attorneys who just haven't dealt with security as it relates to insurance and have missed some stuff. And so it's really important to know what is covered and what is not, and that you are not just automatically covered because you have insurance. So make sure you speak with somebody, whether it be an attorney, just somebody that understands insurance and insurance policies really well, specifically to the cannabis industry, obviously, because those are far and few between. It's a moving target, as we know and said many times before. It's a moving target. It's a unique industry that has other needs that other industries don't. But insurance plays a huge part in the security aspect of things, because again of the exclusions and requirements. If you are found, you might not be covered if you are found to have been negligent in your actions, if your premises was not sufficiently secured, and that's defined various different ways within your insurance policy, or you failed to meet any other specific requirements in your policy. So again, a certificate of insurance is great, but you really, if you for anybody operating right now in the licensed market that's listening to this, if you're not reading your insurance policy and don't understand exactly what those exclusions are, I highly encourage you to start on that immediately. I did give the example of the door requirement. Multi-point locking was the requirement in that specific example. And if you are if you are not in compliance, insurance will not pay. Maybe I should say they may not pay, but they won't pay. We're seeing a lot of that in the industry right now. And again, in part because of the uptick in burglaries and robberies, there's now a pipeline of more insurance claims, and people are, we're fielding calls as sort of word starts to get out that like, wait a minute, I'm paying my policy every month, but I didn't get made whole. I didn't get any money back from my insurance claim, and they're saying, or they're denying me because of X, Y, and Z. So it's just important to know how that document affects your daily business operations and you post-incident. So make sure you consult an expert before buying new doors. I talk to folks that are building out a facility, and one of the first things that we ask is, do you have insurance in place? And if you do, we definitely need to look at that document, look at what the requirements are, because they may differ from the state requirement. They likely will never be less restrictive than the state requirements. They likely will be more restrictive than the state requirements, but we've got to know what they are so that when we design a space, we know that if and when that bad thing happens, you will be made whole again, rather than what we're seeing a lot of, which is operators holding the bag, if you will, forced to self-fund rather than the insurance company claim. So now I want to talk a little bit about vendor contracts. Vendor contracts, again, this is not news, but to a lot of folks, but green taxes, underperformance, non-performance, really poor written contracts with no allocation of risk back to the vendor is extremely common in the cannabis industry, and is extremely common within security in the cannabis industry. It's extremely important to hold vendors accountable, protect your business from liability, and then obviously prevent denied insurance claims. But read these contracts, read the fine print. One example is a video monitoring contract that we reviewed that basically said in the fine print, if the monitoring company doesn't do what they're supposed to do and there's damage to the facility or even injury or death to a human, that they would pay $1,500 at most and be able to walk away. That's language that was in their contract, which is totally unacceptable. But whether they have or don't have cannabis clients, I don't know. We certainly don't use them, but that language is out there, and it's really important to make sure that we hold vendors accountable. I'll stop right here for a quick Q&A if we have time, and I'm happy to revisit any other slides. Again, cannabis security is a moving target with so many different conversations and topics we can touch on off of it. But I thought that given the environment right now and a lot of the pain points that we're seeing operators go through, that this particular slide deck made the most sense for today. So really appreciate you having me on, allowing me to present. I do have to say, go Dubs.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, Chris. And if anybody has some questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll get to those questions. I'll kind of kick it off here a little bit. For us, or in my experience, I deal a lot specifically on the retail end. So when somebody is, if you're really trying to have some foresight, really trying to kind of plan ahead, What is considerations that an operator might consider when they're evaluating a real estate property as to whether, what security aspects they may need to, attend to, or weak spots and vulnerabilities and those sorts of things?
That's a great question, and actually very timely. When people are picking out a property, we look at, however you search for properties, whether it's like, a 420 property or something like that. Right. I think every single, not every single, it's an exaggeration, but a lot of these properties are described as having, 24-hour security. Right. And, our security is dialed. But again, I gave one example of video monitoring that has a horrible contract that basically says, hey, we can mess up. We could not do what we're supposed to do. Not our problem. I mean, that's happening right now. And that's crazy to me. Right. But I would say for folks that are looking at properties to understand, and drill down on what the property currently has going on, because I think oftentimes you can leverage that for a better deal, a better price, better, whether you're leasing or buying, because if you want to know that whatever security systems they already have in place, even if it's guards, we have 24-hour guard service. Somebody's got to do the due diligence to understand, are these folks licensed and insured? Do they have, the proper training, or did they just hire the lowest bidder, to get a body out there? What liability really does exist in this property that I'm interested in taking over in some capacity?
Great answer. Another question that I get brought up a lot is about youth access and preventing. I talk to a lot of elected sometimes, and this is always a concern for them. What role does security play from your experience? I mean, I know from how we incorporate it into our operations, but from your experience, who deals with the security aspects every day. What are those stopgaps? Obviously there's ID checks and things like that, but are there any other enhanced things that maybe we don't know about that security does from that perspective?
The rules and regulations, in part, what jumps to mind right now is limited access areas, where these products and assets are being stored. There's obviously very specific language on the state level and on local levels about how to control ingress and egress. How do we compartmentalize that so not everybody has access to it? But, a lot of ways that, currently, again, how product is getting out onto the street, and in areas and to folks that it shouldn't be, is through these burglaries and robberies. So I'd say, not to be too generic, but I'd say, again, the holistic security solution, understanding what your specific needs are, whether it be retail, cultivation, distribution, even within that, every single business is different. No two retail locations are exactly the same. They've got different employees, different moving parts, different locations, et cetera. So taking a holistic look, a 30,000-foot view, but again, getting away from the status quo, the heavy reliance on guards, vendor accountability, is massive. These are line items that are very expensive for any business, and you should be able to get not only the most out of it, but they should perform to the level that you expect. And if not, there should be mechanisms in place to hold them accountable.
Yeah, no, 100%. In my experience, I've really noticed that, and like you said, each area is different, each community different, each property is different, and certainly there are some situations where having extra security is a necessity to help kind of clean up the immediate area and have those improvements that cities and jurisdictions are looking for. It's interesting. You've talked a lot about guards and 24-hour guards in particular. I really just got out of a conversation with a city about this, because I think from cities' perspectives, the industry comes at it from the perspective of, I think, statistics show that it doesn't really deter anything, and it's a huge cost. And I think from the city's perspectives, the pushback generally is, look, this is still something that's new. There's usually some staff or a couple council members that were kind of on the fence, but it got approved and they don't want to rock the boat. So they end up going with these kind of 24-hour measures. Can you kind of talk a little bit to that as some, if you were me going into those kind of conversations, like what would you tell an elected official that says, we've got to have that 24-hour security. It's the only way we're going to be safe. And that's, because they have that mindset. What would you tell them?
Sure. And that mindset is absolutely supported by the status quo. People look at guards as sort of the end all be all, more guards, less problems. And that's just not the case. When you really drill down and get to the thick of it, guards bring their own level of liability as well. And so my response to specifically, let's say an elected official would be more of a question. What is your goal when you say you want to implement 24-hour security guards? What is the goal there? And why do you think that will work? And the answer typically will be something along the lines of, we believe that guards are a deterrent. But I gave you just a few headlines, and there's so much more data out there that just shows that that's just not the case. Guards are not a deterrent. Bad things still happen when guards are there. And so the next question I like to ask is, what if it doesn't deter? And so do we want armed or unarmed? Do we want a shootout in our parking lot? I mean, these are questions that need to be asked, right? But I think ultimately what people are after is the surveillance coverage, the eyes on a property. There's different ways to do that. CC Security Solutions is early on in looking at, I think, what is going to be very disruptive to the guard industry, and that's using drones as a service, specifically drone and box solutions. There are solutions out there that are much more cost effective than the guard that offer much more coverage as well. And then it's important to understand, what did we want out of our guard? And is that even a viable option? A lot of facilities that we work with only want the guard because they want somebody to call 911. They don't want the guard to take any action. They don't want any enforcement. In fact, they want the guard to leave, go to a safe area. We work on facilities that even have safe rooms for people that, if there's a targeted attack and we're seeing, carloads, dozens of cars and, dozens of people that are armed to the teeth, attacking and targeting these businesses, human safety again is paramount. So we even have some facilities specifically in Oakland that have safe rooms for people, mainly an armed guard, until we can phase that out and replace it with a drone that produces much more surveillance at a cheaper price with none of the liability. A drone doesn't call in sick. It doesn't harass other people. It doesn't show up to work late, things of that nature. Right. So there are ways, in part using other technologies, and video monitoring is a piece of that, to limit that guard hour. But I'd say, it would be more of a question. What is the goal? When you say we want 24-hour guard coverage, and what do you think the expectation is? And are you aware of what COVID has done to the guard industry? And we can just Google right now almost any guard company, that's providing personnel, and they're hiring now. And so what does that tell you about, the ability to keep and retain and ultimately find the right person for the job?
We got a question in the chat, and it goes right along with what my next thought was when you mentioned drones. Their question is, are there any retailers using drones in San Francisco? And my kind of sort of addendum to that would be, drones seem to make a lot of sense to me, especially at a cultivation facility. It's a big area. Can you maybe explain, as you answer their question about drones being used in San Francisco, how would they be implemented into other operational situations, manufacturing, distribution, and retail in particular?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there are not any active drones being utilized at retail locations in San Francisco yet. I think that there should be, and I think that again, this is a very new idea. It's new technology. There's a service level side to the hardware, and there's a lot of companies that are producing drone and box solutions for upwards of, very expensive, into 6 figures, easy. But then there's the service level side. Who's going to pilot it? Those are the things that we've focused on the last several months to really figure out and how to solve that. But to your point about other license types using it, absolutely. Depending on the hardware, and there's a lot of different hardwares out there. Again, they can replace guards and they can cover more areas than personnel can. Perimeter protection, specifically on outdoor cultivation, is extremely important. If you can lock down the exterior perimeter of an outdoor cultivation, you have, covered a lot of ground, put yourself in a good spot to do the other things that you need to do with respect to security. And a drone can do that. But there's just different things to consider. It's, beyond the FAA waivers and things like that, there's different piloting licenses. And again, very, very specific insurance. And I can say that because we've spoken to the few people that do cover this on the insurance side, and they haven't seen it yet. And so that's how new it is that, it was really difficult to get a policy that was custom made to be able to even offer a solution like that.
And then, comparatively, if you're comparing it to a physical security guard, a physical security guard is there for X amount of hours for their shift. What is the time span that a drone may be on duty, on surveillance, that it would be, constantly there?
So, the solutions that we're looking at and implementing are drone and box solutions that typically live on a roof or in a secured area that are not accessible to, the average person, would take a lot of time to get to. So, there's just so many things I want to talk about with drones now. It's very exciting, but again, limiting the hours, it can be a big cost reduction, and they can live, again, the hardware it varies. So there are some that fly for 15 minutes at a time, all on their own. And then there's some that are what they call tethered models, where the power comes from the tether that the drone's attached to and it never leaves. Then they have tethered models where you can drop it and then go free fly somewhere else. Depending on, again, the FAA waiver, the need, in that specific use case, a drone can live in a sky, from anywhere from 15 minutes to, over an hour. And then they return home to the box to charge, and then they go again. And then, there's so many other little layers I could talk about, but to answer the question, as basically as I can, 15 minutes to an hour.
Interesting. So in a system like that, it sounds like you would kind of need a schedule, maybe, like if you were to do strictly drones for your overnight coverage, assuming you would really want to have at least a couple drones that you could alternate in between their charges, it sounds like. So
that's one way to do it. The issue with that the hardware folks haven't figured out yet is how to get two drones into a box effectively, right? And so again, this technology can be expensive depending on what the requirements are and use cases are. But again, if the goal is just surveillance, these things can be tied into and API'd into. This is the tech stuff that folks on my team can talk to a lot better than I can. But it can be API'd into other technologies, perimeter detection systems, alarm systems. Again, video monitoring as well. They can be on planned and unplanned patrols and missions. There's just so many things that you can do with it. But again, it's so new that some people are turned off by it. But I think that it absolutely is the direction that the industry is headed, specifically cannabis. I see a lot of use cases, in not only urban environments, but obviously outdoor cultivation spaces as well, where we're working on a very, very, very large outdoor cultivation in New York, well over 100 acres in total. And, they're going to have a couple, right? But their alternative was, hey, Chris, we were going to chase on a guard proposal at, $40 an hour, $30 an hour, 24/7. Just the math on that is ridiculous. Right. So, and again, it's important to set the expectation. What is the goal of this person in this role? What do we hope to achieve? And how can we utilize technology to do it cheaper, safer, with less liability?
Gotcha. Another question in the chat from Greg McCluskey. What's the solution for people cutting power? So in the middle of the night, thereby cutting off contact to the alarm company, the sheriff, the video monitoring, whatever. You go in and you put in all this stuff, but what if they just clip the power, or can they even do that?
Sure. Okay. So, if you can think it, someone can do it. Right. And so how do we circumvent that? I think it's really important. That's a great question, and great for the person who asked it, who's contemplating prior to. But, a lot of times, and we go into, a big piece of our business, I would say, unfortunately, is existing businesses where these things are happening and they just didn't expect it. No one, their previous vendor, their previous consultant, whoever touched that property previously, didn't contemplate those things. And again, extremely problematic with vendors that have no accountability. So with respect to power, we've got to look at and contemplate battery backup, whether it be generators or battery packs, but there needs to be processes in place to alert the proper people when that happens. So if a facility just goes dark, and let's just say that happens for whatever reason, whether it be, some sort of weather issue or, a earthquake, or somebody cut the power intentionally, there needs to be mechanisms in place to have proper reporting protocols. So that is totally contemplated. If the power is just out, there are systems that should, and not all of them do, but I think they should, have an alerting mechanism built in that allows and notifies promptly when that happens. And then, again, just contemplating that, thinking through for your specific facility, whether, in my head, I'm thinking of retail, or in my head, I'm thinking of a indoor cultivation. How does that affect my business? What would I do? Who needs to get called? And how do we get back up and running as quickly as possible?
Great. Another question from Ed Brown. For a small retail store, would you recommend putting an access control unit, DVR, in the ceiling or behind a fake wall? What kind of security? So maybe somebody breaks in and they're like, "Oh, I'm just going to take the tape out of the recorder."
Right. So, great question. These questions are always really hard to answer, because I want to be as accurate as I can. And when a question's asked about a generic space I haven't seen, it's really difficult. So I would say, to try to answer the question as best as I can, I would say, absolutely, we need to contemplate, how to secure it, whether that be securing it or, as the question indicated, hiding it. Hiding something is one level and one way to attack, sort of the protection of an asset. We can lock it down, in a safe, or to the person who asked the question's point, what if I put it somewhere that, the offenders or the suspects aren't going to look, or I don't think they're going to look. But again, important to understand the rules and regulations around specifically DVRs and NVRs. And they are very specific on the state level. When you get down to the municipality level, typically we see mirrored regulations. You will never see less restrictive regulations, but you might see more restrictive regulations than the state. And the state does require you to secure your DVR in a very specific manner. And so just hiding it behind a false wall might not, I can tell you, is not going to be in compliance with what the DCC says.
That makes sense. Let's circle back. We've talked about a lot of other little things. You mentioned it earlier, and it's kind of like the blueprint for everything else is the security plan itself, because, that's really the very first step in this whole process, is evaluating and creating that plan. And then, because that's part of what you're submitting with your application, if you're applying for a license or something along those lines. What do you have any tips or things specifically that you think are really important to have, pointed out and really emphasized on those security plans?
Yes. And it might not be the answer somebody would expect, but the answer, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because it's something that we deal with all the time. It's unfortunately something that I see after the fact. Again, we get a fair amount of our clients come from other, whether it be other firms or they basically existing businesses that, shoot, this is happening to me, I need to solve it, and we're brought in to do that. And then you have this security plan that gets sort of brought up. And as you noted, and to your point, it is a part of the application process. So it is a requirement. I'd say the biggest thing to take away from the answer is to treat the security plan as a living, breathing document that it is. It is much more than just checking the box. And a lot of people look at the security plan as just a box check to move on. And in part, I get that. There are so many different barriers to entry into this industry that, you want to just sort of get things going and get things to sort of shake loose for you so you can get open. But it is really important to understand that the security plan is a living, breathing document that evolves with your business and provides a ton of value, specifically with onboarding employees, employee training, and the like. It's really important to understand that it is more than just checking the box and moving on. Although it is a requirement of the application process, it's a very valuable document if taken seriously and contemplated, a lot of these SOPs and incidences that can happen.
Yeah, I know for us, we've got a few locations where, we've expanded, we've changed the layout, and obviously every time we do something like that, like you said, it's a living document where you have to kind of make alterations, and it evolves with your business as your business changes and grows as well. It makes a lot of sense.
Yep. And I get it. Listen, I get it. People just want to move on to the next thing. And I hear it, but it's something that we've seen come back to bite folks. And, just the goal, I think, with just trying to answer that question is to try to help people avoid stepping in landmines. But it's obviously front and center in the application process. Obviously comes with a lot of different conversations and meetings on the city level, a lot of good neighbor meetings and things of that nature. So having a well-dialed security plan and one that evolves with your business is not only cost effective long-term, but just provides a ton of value for the operational side of your business.
I know it's not maybe a main concern for, as far as, guards, and maybe specifically when it comes to security, it's maybe not considered specifically security, but how does, since you mentioned like reaching out to neighbors and being a good neighbor and that outreach, how much does that play a factor? Because in my experience, the more outreach that you do, the more you know your neighbors, you talk to your neighbors, fellow businesses, whether it's whatever kind of neighbors it is, that really goes a long way in kind of, cleaning up the area and really making it feel more safe and having, open dialogue with everyone that's got eyes on the area.
Absolutely. I mean, community relations is extremely important, and municipalities are increasingly requiring it. Beyond, just, I think, the common sense and right thing to do. Municipalities are requiring good neighbor policies. They're requiring outreach. One mentality that we hear a lot from clients is that, I'm scared to reach out because, if they find out I'm cannabis, they might raise a stink. And if I just say nothing, maybe they just won't notice, and they'll see, the sort of fruits of our labor and the benefits of a license. I mean, I've said this when I was a police officer working Market Street in downtown San Francisco. I can show you where a liquor store used to be in downtown San Francisco, and then 2 blocks down where a dispensary is, and the positive benefits that business has on that block is, outstanding, and, really important. So I think, for community outreach, it's an opportunity to let your neighbors know the benefits of the business. And, I say this all the time, and I say it totally truthfully. I would happily, have no problem if a dispensary opened up in my neighborhood where I'm raising my family, because on the security side, I understand intimately, probably better than some, I think, the benefits that come along with the business because of the regulations around security and the requirements just to be operational, just to get going, the things you have to do that other businesses don't. And again, specifically, a liquor store in my old Footbeat in San Francisco is not there, right? But the remnants of sort of are still there within the neighborhood, but just, again, 2 blocks down at a dispensary. And then that leads me to one more point. I just want to tell this real quick story. I was, that dispensary had opened up, and I walked by. The staff seemed super friendly. I like to think I'm a kind of a friendly dude, and, started chatting them up. And I was like, here's my business card. I'm a Footbeat officer in the neighborhood. If you need me, this is kind of where my area. And I chatted them up a little bit. They showed me inside. It was awesome. Great interaction, right? From both ends. I walk out of the store, and my sergeant's in the middle of Market Street, waves me over to his car, and he says, don't go in those businesses. Stay away from those places. And if you ask around enough about me, you'll know that my response to him was no. You can't tell me not to go to a legal business. This is a legal business. It's tax paying. You make me stand in front of the Gap the day after Thanksgiving, right? And that's a retail store, but these people need to get the same amount of love and, services that any other tax paying businesses get. But that's just to show you the mentality. And then I took it one step further, and I just said, hey, listen, if you really feel this way, write that in an email. Document it for me, something that I can have on my phone that says, my boss told me not to go into that store, and you'll never do that. But law enforcement has a way, and I'm not hating on law enforcement, but this is the truth. They have a way of operating outside of the rules, sort of in a clandestine manner. This boss of mine never wrote the email, just kind of probably got mad that I didn't listen to him. But that was that. But that's in part some of the mentality that's still very much alive and well in law enforcement. So having good community relations and people, sort of to back you up is extremely important.
Yeah, it's frustrating, and I get it. You look, a lot of people in law enforcement, they made their careers out of the war on drugs, and it's very difficult to probably let that go. Aside from the fact that change in general is very difficult to make happen. But it's necessary. The industry has to have a transparent relationship with law enforcement at the local level. You've got to have that dialogue. As like you were referencing earlier, you never know when something's going to happen, a car accident or a burglary down the street, and you might catch it on your cameras. I know that certainly happened with us before. And so, it's frustrating to encounter law enforcement that isn't open-minded, to at least have a dialogue and a conversation. I don't expect them to support us, but at least be open to let's make this as safe as possible. Let's educate people as much as possible, and let's create an environment for safe access, because I think that's really what we're all trying to strive toward.
Absolutely. And anytime you deal with any governmental entity, but especially law enforcement, I always tell people, document. Document who you spoke to, what the ask was, what the request was, or the demand was, get a badge number, get a report number, document who you speak to within law enforcement is extremely important. Again, because there are so many benefits that a cannabis business brings to a community that may overlap with law enforcement at some point. We cannot rely on them to be our cheerleaders and champion, all of the good work that we're doing. So it's important to keep a log and make sure you hold on to that, because it can be very valuable with community relations or any sort of other regulatory issues that you may come up with in the future.
For sure. And as we're coming up on our time here, tell everybody where they can find out more information about you, where they can follow, where they can get in touch with you at online.
Sure.
Maybe drop your contact info in the chat there as well.
Yeah, I'll just do that right now. I'll drop my email in here. And then the website as well. And again, thank you, everybody. I'm going to try to multitask, type and talk at the same time, but really appreciate having me on. And thank you so much, Matthew, for the dialogue as well. And thank you for all the great questions that were asked.
Absolutely. And just for those that will be watching this maybe on replay, can you verbally tell people where they can find you? Is it what's your website?
It's my website. There's no www. Apparently that's important in a thing. My website is ccsecuritysolutions.com. We're on Instagram as well. Hopefully not too hard to find. If we are, I need to talk to my SEO manager. Get it awesome. and have some vendor accountability like I talk about so much. So there you go. Please, for anybody attending now or listening to it later, please don't hesitate to reach out. We don't charge for consultations. We are very much focused on bringing value where we believe it's needed with respect to security in the cannabis industry. And that's our ultimate goal. If we can solve a problem, we're super happy and pumped about it. So please reach out with any questions you may have, and we look forward to future dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. And before we let everybody go today, I just wanted to run down some of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce's upcoming events on June 23rd. If you're going to be in the Orange County area of California, we will have our Summer Expo and Mixer with a panel of Orange County electeds from Huntington Beach, Costa Mesa, and Santa Ana. That event will also be catered by celebrity chef Matthew Stockard. So be sure to check that out. You can find out more information on our website, thecannabis.chamber.com. Also coming up right after that in July will be our LA events. On July 21st, we'll have a consumption event that will be occurring at Green Street in downtown LA. So again, be sure to check that out. More information coming. We'll also have the week after that a virtual event that will focus on consumption lounges. We'll have several experts that have opened lounges or operating lounges throughout the state and throughout the nation. So that will be a very informative one as well. And then we've got some other events that'll be coming up later on in the summer as well as this fall. So again, be sure to stop by thecannabischamber.com onto our events page and make sure to check those out and not miss anything. Thank you for joining, everyone. And until next time, have a great day.